I remember the taste of grox fat on my lips when I first heard the commissar's boots on our hab block stairs. My name is Jarn Kellec, former factory worker of Hive Secundus, current conscript of the 47th Cadian Shock Regiment. You think that makes me a hero, but you don't know what I've seen. The real horror isn't the Xenos tearing through your squad mates, or the Chaos cultists screaming blasphemies as they die. It's the moment you realize that the Imperium considers you exactly as valuable as the lasgun they put in your hands. A replaceable tool to be used until it breaks. They don't want you to know that guard service isn't about glory or honor. It's about feeding human lives into the galaxy's meat grinder fast enough to keep the machine running. This is my testimony of what happens when the Emperor's call to arms finds your door. Chapter 1. The Summons. The conscription notice arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a servo-skull that hummed the Imperial hymnal in a voice like grinding metal. I was eating breakfast in the communal mess of Hab Block 7749, trying to stretch my weekly protein ration across 7 days like every other worker in Hive Secundus. The skull descended through the recycled air like a mechanical angel of death, its red eyes scanning identification tattoos until it found mine. Citizen Jarn Kellec, worker designation 774943 Alpha, you are hereby summoned to report for mandatory Imperial Guard service evaluation. Report to Conscription Center Gamma within 72 hours. Failure to comply will result in execution for dereliction of duty. The Emperor protects. The data slate it dropped onto my table contained my entire life, reduced to numbers and statistics. Age, 23. Physical condition, acceptable. Mental stability, within parameters. Combat experience, none. Education level, basic literacy, numerical competency, Imperial doctrine fundamentals. Family status, no dependents. Social value, minimal. That last entry was what sealed my fate. In the cold mathematics of Imperial bureaucracy, I was expendable. No wife, no children, no specialized skills that made me irreplaceable in the Hive's industrial machinery. Just another body to feed into the Emperor's endless appetite for soldiers. Around me, the mess hall had gone silent. Everyone knew what the servo-skull meant, what the conscription notice represented. In Hive Secundus, we all lived with the knowledge that someday our number might come up. But knowing something intellectually and feeling it happen to you were entirely different experiences. Marcus Venn, who worked the next shift over in the Prometheum refinery, set down his recaf cup with hands that shook slightly. "How long do you have?" 3 days, I replied, my voice sounding strange in my own ears. 3 days to report for evaluation. Evaluation, scoffed Elena Core from across the table. She was older than most of us, maybe 45, with the kind of deep lines around her eyes that came from spending 2 decades staring into furnace fires. They call it evaluation, but we all know what it really is. They need bodies for some campaign, so they grab whoever's expendable. She was right, of course. The Imperium didn't conduct evaluations when they needed skilled technicians or experienced administrators. They conducted evaluations when they needed warm bodies to hold lasguns and march toward enemy positions. The fact that I was being called up meant somewhere in the galaxy, Imperial forces were taking casualties faster than they could be replaced. The rest of that day passed in a blur of familiar routines that suddenly felt surreal. I reported to my shift supervisor, filed the appropriate paperwork for temporary leave, and collected my final pay chit from the automated dispenser. Everything proceeded according to standard protocol, as if being drafted for probable death was just another administrative procedure. But that evening, alone in my hab unit, the reality of my situation finally hit me. I was looking at the few personal possessions I had accumulated over 23 years of life. A collection of data slates containing downloaded entertainment feeds, a jacket that had belonged to my father before the Factorum accident claimed him, a small statue of the Emperor carved from synthetic bone. It wasn't much to show for a life, but it was mine. And in 3 days, I would be leaving it all behind for a future that statistical probability suggested would be measured in weeks rather than years. The conscription center was located in the middle levels of Hive Secundus, in what had once been a commercial district before the gradual population decline had left half the storefronts empty. The building itself was a monument to imperial efficiency, a massive concrete structure with no decoration beyond the aquila carved above the main entrance, and the phrase, "Service unto death," inscribed in High Gothic below it. I arrived early, partly out of nervous energy, and partly because arriving late for anything involving the Imperial Guard was a good way to get shot. The queue of conscripts stretched around the block, young men and women from across the hive, all wearing the same expression of resigned dread that I could feel on my own face. Most of them were like me, factory workers, hab maintenance technicians, low-level clerks whose disappearance wouldn't significantly impact hive operations. But there were others too. A few gang members whose organizations had been marked for voluntary conscription, some petty criminals offered the choice between guard service and execution, and a handful of individuals whose only crime had been being in the wrong place when the recruitment quotas needed filling. The processing began at dawn and continued with mechanical precision. We shuffled forward in lines that moved with the efficiency of a factory conveyor belt, each step bringing us closer to whatever judgment waited inside the building. Guards in carapace armor watched us with the bored attention of professionals who had seen this process thousands of times before. When my turn finally came, I found myself standing before a desk staffed by a clerk whose augmetic eyes scanned data feeds with inhuman speed. Behind him, a commissar in the distinctive coat and cap of the political officer corps reviewed files with the kind of attention that suggested he was looking for reasons to reject candidates rather than approve them. "Jarn Kellec," the clerk announced without looking up. "Age 23, factory worker specialization, no criminal record, no family obligations. Physical evaluation score, 7 out of 10. Mental stability assessment, within acceptable parameters. Marksmanship aptitude, untested but projected adequate." The commissar, a thin man with eyes like chips of ice, finally looked up from his data slate. "Any specialized skills? Technical training beyond basic industrial certification? Language capabilities beyond Low Gothic?" "No, sir," I replied, remembering to add the honorific at the last second. "Religious objections to combat service? Medical conditions that would prevent extended campaign deployment? Political affiliations that might compromise loyalty to the imperial cause?" "No, sir. No, sir. And no, sir." He made a note on his data slate and stamped my file with the kind of finality that suggested appeals would not be entertained. "Conscript Kellec, you are hereby inducted into the Imperial Guard effective immediately. Report to Transport Base 7 within 6 hours for departure to Training Facility Designation Gamma Tertius. You are now the property of the Emperor's military forces. Serve with honor." The phrase, "property of the Emperor's military forces," echoed in my mind as I was processed through the final administrative stations. Medical examination, cursory, equipment assignment, a duffel bag containing basic clothing and toiletries, and transportation coordination. A seat on a transport ship leaving that evening. In the space of 6 hours, I had ceased to be Jarn Kellec, factory worker, and citizen of Hive Secundus. I had become Guard Conscript 447889 Delta, serial number encoded into a metal tag that was welded around my wrist with a finality that made my new status impossible to ignore. The transport ship was a converted cargo hauler called the Iron Will, its passenger compartments filled with tiered racks of seats that had clearly been designed for maximum capacity rather than comfort. As I strapped myself in for what the departure announcements indicated would be a 3-week journey through the warp, I looked around at the other conscripts who would be sharing my immediate future. There was Davek Kane, a former gang enforcer whose scarred knuckles and predatory smile suggested he might actually thrive in military service. Beside him sat Lucia Voss, a young woman whose clean hands and precise way of speaking marked her as probably an administrative worker who had been in the wrong place when the recruitment sweep came through. Near the back of the compartment, a massive man named Torvin Cray sat in silence that radiated the kind of dangerous calm that suggested violence was never far from the surface. As the ship's engines rumbled to life and we began the slow ascent from Hive Secundus toward the orbital departure point, I pressed my face against the small porthole beside my seat and watched my homeworld shrink away beneath us. The hive city that had been my entire universe for 23 years became first a collection of towering spires, then a sprawling metal growth on the planet's surface, then finally just a bright spot on a brown and grey world that itself disappeared into the star field. I was leaving behind everything I had ever known for a future that Imperial propaganda described as glorious service to the Emperor, but that everyone really understood was a lottery ticket for an ugly death in service to causes I would never understand. The warp transit began 12 hours later, and with it came the dreams. In the dreams, I was standing in a place that might have been a field or might have been a crater, holding something that might have been a lasgun or might have been a prayer book. Around me, figures that might have been enemies or might have been friends were screaming in languages that hurt to hear. Above us all, something that was definitely not the sky was burning with colors that had no names. I woke from these dreams with the taste of metal in my mouth and the growing certainty that whatever was waiting for me at training facility Gamma Tertius was going to change me in ways that had nothing to do with learning how to march in formation or strip a weapon for cleaning. The other conscripts were having similar experiences. As the journey continued, conversations became subdued, laughter became forced, and everyone began to develop the kind of hunted look that comes from sleeping badly for weeks at a time. The ship's medici staff dismissed our complaints as normal adjustment responses to warp travel, but their explanations felt hollow when you were living through the experience. On the 19th day of our journey, Lucia Voss attempted suicide. I found her in one of the ship's maintenance corridors, trying to open an airlock with hands that shook so badly she couldn't work the manual controls. When I asked her what she was doing, she turned to me with eyes that held the kind of despair that comes from seeing too far into your own future. "They're going to kill us," she whispered. "Maybe not today, maybe not next week, but eventually. They're going to march us towards something that wants to tear us apart, and they're going to tell us it's for the Emperor's glory. And we're going to do it because we don't have any choice." I helped her away from the airlock and sat with her in the corridor until the medical staff arrived. But her words stayed with me for the rest of the journey, because deep down, I knew she was right. We were traveling toward our own destruction with the same mechanical inevitability as the ship's engines carrying us through the warp. Training facility. Gamma Tertius turned out to be a moon-sized military installation orbiting a dead world in a system whose name appeared on no civilian star charts. As our transport ship docked with the facility's primary receiving bay, I looked out at a structure that seemed to stretch from horizon to horizon. Endless barracks, training grounds, firing ranges, and parade squares designed to process human beings into soldiers with industrial efficiency. Standing on the dock as we disembarked was a drill instructor whose voice could probably be heard from orbit, and whose expression suggested that our arrival was the most disappointing event in recorded galactic history. "Listen up, you pathetic excuses for human beings," he bellowed as we stumbled off the transport. "My name is Sergeant Major Vex Corvain, and for the next 16 weeks, I am going to be the most important person in your miserable lives. You came here as civilians, which means you came here as nothing. You will leave here as Imperial Guardsmen, which means you will leave here as instruments of the Emperor's will." He paused, his augmetic eyes scanning our group with mechanical precision. "Some of you are probably wondering what you've gotten yourselves into. Some of you are probably having second thoughts about your patriotic duty to serve. Let me clarify something for you right now. You don't get to have second thoughts anymore. You belong to the Imperial Guard now, and the Imperial Guard belongs to the Emperor, and the Emperor's will is absolute." As he continued his welcoming speech, I looked around at my fellow conscripts and saw my own thoughts reflected in their faces. We had crossed a line that morning, stepping from civilian transportation onto military ground. There was no going back now, no appeals process, no way to reconsider our situation. We were soldiers now, whether we wanted to be or not, and our real education was about to begin. Chapter 2. Breaking Point. The first thing they killed was our names. "From now on, you are not Jarn Kellec," drill instructor Hadron Vash screamed into my face from a distance of approximately 3 centimeters. "You are conscript 447889 Delta. You are not a person. You are not an individual. You are a component in the Emperor's war machine. Do you understand me, conscript?" "Yes, sir," I replied, trying to match the volume of his voice, despite the fact that my throat was already raw from 2 hours of shouting responses to questions I barely understood. "I can't hear you, conscript. The Emperor's enemies are loud. They scream when they charge your positions. They roar when they smell your fear. If you can't make more noise than a dying heretic, how are you going to maintain communication in combat?" "Yes, sir," I bellowed, putting every ounce of air in my lungs behind the words. "Better. Now drop and give me 50 push-ups while reciting the Imperial Creed. And if I hear you use your civilian name again, you'll be spending the next week cleaning latrines with your tongue." The training regimen at Gamma-Tertius was designed according to principles that had been refined over 10,000 years of turning ordinary human beings into soldiers capable of facing the galaxy's worst nightmares. Physical conditioning, weapons training, tactical instruction, and indoctrination proceeded with mechanical precision, each component building on the previous one to create what the training manuals called the perfect Imperial Guardsman. But what the manuals didn't mention was that creating the perfect Imperial Guardsman required first destroying whoever you had been before. The physical conditioning began before dawn each day and continued until well after dusk. Running, calisthenics, obstacle courses, endurance trials, and combat exercises designed to push human limitations to the breaking point and then push further. Within the first week, 3 conscripts from my intake group had collapsed from exhaustion and been shipped back to their homeworlds as unsuitable for military service. Within the second week, that number had risen to 7. The survivors learned quickly that complaining about the difficulty was pointless. The drill instructors had heard every possible objection, every plea for mercy, every excuse for failure that human creativity could devise. Their responses were uniform: work harder, complain less. Remember that the galaxy's most dangerous enemies wouldn't show mercy to soldiers who couldn't meet Imperial standards. Weapons training introduced us to the M36 lasgun, the standard armament of the Imperial Guard, and quite possibly the most reliable piece of technology in human space. "This weapon will save your life," weapons instructor Corvin announced on our first day at the firing range, holding up a lasgun with the kind of reverence usually reserved for holy relics. "This weapon will kill your enemies. This weapon is more important to you than food, water, or air, because without it, you are just meat waiting to be slaughtered." Learning to strip, clean, maintain, and fire the lasgun became a daily ritual that consumed hours of our training schedule. But more than just technical instruction, it was an exercise in developing the kind of automatic responses that might keep us alive in situations where conscious thought would be too slow. "In combat, you don't think about firing your weapon," Instructor Corvin explained as we practiced reload drills for the 1,000th time. "You don't think about aiming. You don't think about breathing or stance or trigger control. All of that has to be automatic, burned into your nervous system so deep that you can do it in the dark, under fire, with half your squad dead around you." The tactical instruction covered everything from basic marching formations to complex multi-unit coordinated assaults. We learned to read battlefield maps, to understand radio protocols, to coordinate with other Imperial forces, and to follow orders immediately and without question, regardless of how suicidal they might appear. But it was the indoctrination that truly changed us. Every morning began with recitation of the Imperial Creed, led by Commissar Thaddeus Corrin, a political officer whose job was ensuring our loyalty to the Emperor's cause remained absolute. Every evening ended with lessons on Imperial history, the nature of the galaxy's threats, and our duty as servants of humanity's survival. "You are not fighting for glory," Commissar Corrin would remind us during these sessions. "You are not fighting for personal advancement or material gain. You are fighting because if you don't fight, humanity dies. The Xenos races want to enslave or exterminate us. The forces of chaos want to corrupt us into playthings for their dark gods. The enemies of the Imperium outnumber us millions to one, and the only thing standing between human civilization and complete annihilation is the Imperial Guard. The message was repeated so often and with such conviction that it became impossible to question. We were humanity's last line of defense, the thin red line that kept the darkness at bay. Our individual lives might be expendable, but our collective service was the most important thing in the galaxy. It was during the 6th week of training that I truly understood what the Guard was doing to us. We were conducting a night exercise in the facility's urban warfare training area, a mock city built from modular components that could be reconfigured to simulate different types of combat environments. My squad had been tasked with clearing a series of buildings while under simulated enemy fire, using live ammunition and real explosives to make the exercise as realistic as possible. Everything was going according to plan until conscript Lucia Voss, the former administrative worker who had attempted suicide during our transport journey, missed a corner while advancing through a building and walked directly into a training mine. The explosion killed her instantly, turning a young woman who had been learning to laugh again into a cloud of red mist and scattered body parts. The training scenario continued without pause, our drill instructors shouting orders for us to maintain formation, advance on objectives, and complete the mission despite the casualty. It was only after the exercise concluded that Sergeant Major Corvain addressed what had happened. Conscript Voss made a tactical error that resulted in her death, he announced to our assembled group. Her mistake was failing to properly clear corners before advancing. Learn from her error, or join her in death. That was it. No moment of silence, no acknowledgement of loss, no recognition that a human being had just died. Just a clinical analysis of tactical failure and a warning not to repeat it. Later that night, lying in my bunk and staring at the empty bed where Lucia's gear was being packed for return to her family, I realized that her death hadn't been an accident. The training mine had been placed exactly where the exercise parameters would force someone to encounter it. The drill instructors had known that someone would die during the exercise, and they had allowed it to happen because death was part of the training. They weren't just teaching us to be soldiers, they were teaching us to accept death, our own and others, as a routine part of military service. The psychological pressure was carefully calibrated to break down our civilian identities while building up military ones. Sleep deprivation, constant stress, physical exhaustion, and social isolation from everything we had known before combined to create a state where following orders became easier than thinking for ourselves. Conscript Davek Kane, the former gang enforcer, adapted to military life with frightening ease. His background in organized violence translated well to guard training, and within a few weeks he was being held up as an example for the rest of us to follow. But late at night, when he thought no one was listening, I could hear him crying in his bunk. I used to know who I was, he confided to me one evening during a brief break in our training schedule. I used to have goals, plans, people I cared about. Now I spend all day learning how to kill things I've never seen for reasons I don't understand, and somehow that's supposed to be noble. Conscript Torvin Cray, the massive man who had radiated dangerous calm during our transport journey, took a different approach. He threw himself into the training with absolute dedication, mastering every skill, exceeding every standard, becoming exactly the kind of soldier the instructors wanted to produce. But his success came at the cost of something essential in his personality. The quiet humanity that had made him seem dangerous before was replaced by an efficient emptiness that was far more frightening. As for myself, I discovered that I was surprisingly good at being a soldier. The physical conditioning was challenging, but not impossible. The weapons training came naturally. The tactical instruction made sense once I understood the underlying principles. But every step forward in my military development felt like a step away from the person I had been before. The breaking point came during the 12th week of training, during an exercise designed to test our responses to extreme battlefield conditions. We were divided into squads and placed in a simulation chamber that could replicate the environmental conditions of dozens of different worlds. Everything from the ice fields of Vostroyan recruiting worlds to the jungle hell of Katachan death worlds. My squad drew the desert scenario, which meant spending 72 hours in a chamber heated to temperatures that made breathing painful, while carrying full combat loads and engaging simulated enemies that appeared at random intervals. Water was rationed, food was minimal, and the psychological pressure was enhanced by recordings of actual battlefield communications from Imperial Guard units that had been overrun by enemy forces. By the second day, conscript Jarn Kellec, a former factory supervisor who had been conscripted along with me, began showing signs of heat exhaustion. By the third day, he was barely conscious. But when I suggested that we request medical assistance, Squad Leader Kane ordered me to maintain mission focus. "Soldiers die in the field all the time," he said, with the kind of matter-of-fact brutality that our training had instilled in all of us. "If Kellec can't handle a training exercise, how's he going to handle real combat? Better to find out now than when lives depend on him." I watched Jarn Kellec die of dehydration while lying in the corner of our simulation chamber. His lips cracked and bleeding as he whispered the names of family members we would never meet. The exercise continued until its scheduled conclusion 6 hours later, at which point medical staff arrived to remove his body and critique our performance. Adequate response to battlefield casualties was the official evaluation. Maintained mission focus despite loss of team member. Demonstrated proper understanding of mission priorities. That night, I sat in the barracks common area and tried to remember what I had cared about before being drafted. My job at the factory seemed like a memory from someone else's life. The HAB unit where I had lived for 23 years felt like a location from a story I had once read. Even my own name, my real name, not the numerical designation the guard had assigned me, sounded strange when I tried to say it aloud. They had succeeded in killing the civilian I had been and replacing him with something that could watch a friend die and call it adequate response to battlefield casualties. But the transformation wasn't complete yet, because part of me still remembered enough to be horrified by what I was becoming. The final phase of our training began with an announcement from Commissar Corrin that filled me with a dread that had nothing to do with physical danger. "Congratulations, conscripts. You have successfully completed basic military training. In 4 weeks, you will graduate and receive your assignments to active Imperial Guard regiments. But first, you must complete one final exercise. A live combat mission against actual enemies of the Imperium." The live combat mission turned out to be a pacification operation on a moon, where local miners had refused to meet their ore production quotas and had been classified as rebels against Imperial authority. Our graduating class would be deployed alongside veteran Guard units to suppress the rebellion and restore order to the mining colony. As I cleaned my lasgun and prepared my equipment for actual combat, I wondered if the person I had been before conscription would have been able to pull the trigger on unarmed miners whose only crime was failing to meet impossible production targets. I was afraid that I already knew the answer. Chapter 3. First Blood. The Rebellion on Mining Colony. Xerion 7 had been in progress for 3 local months when our transport ships began their final approach to the lunar surface. From orbit, the colony looked peaceful enough. A collection of industrial facilities and worker habitations spread across a crater floor, connected by transit tunnels that protected the miners from the moon's hostile environment. But the intelligence briefings told a different story. Production quotas missed by increasingly large margins. Work gangs refusing direct orders from colonial administration. Acts of sabotage against critical mining equipment. And finally, the execution of Imperial Governor Thaddeus Vane and his entire administrative staff by miners who had declared their independence from Imperial authority. "This is what rebellion looks like," Commissar Corrin announced, as our transport ships descended through the thin atmosphere toward the colony's primary landing pad. "This is what happens when Imperial citizens forget their duty to the Emperor and the Imperium. Your mission is simple: restore order, resume production, and eliminate any elements that cannot be pacified." Sitting in the transport's cramped passenger compartment, surrounded by 40 other newly graduated guardsmen who were about to experience their first real combat, I checked my equipment for the 1,000th time. Lasgun, charged and ready. Ammunition, 6 spare power cells. Fragmentation grenades, 2 properly secured. Combat knife, sharp enough to cut through reinforced clothing. First aid supplies, adequate for minor injuries. Everything was exactly as it should be, exactly as our training had taught us to prepare for combat operations. But no amount of training could have prepared us for the psychological reality of being sent to kill people whose only crime was refusing to work themselves to death for the benefit of distant Imperial bureaucrats. The colony's main industrial sector had been secured by veteran guard units from the 23rd Vostroyan Firstborn, professional soldiers whose efficiency and discipline made our newly graduated status embarrassingly obvious. Colonel Marcus Vane, brother of the executed governor and commanding officer of the pacification force, briefed our unit with the kind of clinical precision that came from decades of similar operations. The rebel elements have fortified themselves in Industrial Sector 7 and Residential Complex Delta, he explained, indicating positions on a holographic map of the colony. Intelligence suggests approximately 300 armed miners, equipped with industrial tools modified for combat use, improvised explosives, and a small number of legitimate weapons stolen from colonial security forces. He paused, his augmetic eyes scanning our ranks with mechanical precision. This is not a conventional military engagement. These are not professional soldiers. They are desperate civilians who have made the mistake of believing they can resist Imperial authority. Your objectives are to minimize damage to critical infrastructure while eliminating resistance and restoring order. The sanitized language couldn't disguise what we were really being asked to do. We were being sent to massacre people whose only weapons were mining tools and whose only crime was wanting to live somewhere other than the hell of an Imperial mining colony. But 6 months of intensive training had done their work. When the order came to advance on our assigned objectives, I fell into formation with the automatic precision that had been beaten into us by endless drill sessions. Whatever reservations I might have had about the mission were overwhelmed by the muscle memory of following orders without question. The advance through the colony's industrial sector was eerily quiet. The regular mining operations had been suspended, leaving the massive ore processors and refinery equipment standing silent like sleeping giants. Our footsteps echoed off the metal walls and deck plates, accompanied by the distant hum of life support systems that was the only sound in the abandoned facilities. It was in the transition zone between Industrial Sector 6 and 7 that we encountered our first real resistance. The improvised explosive device that detonated beneath Guardsman Torvin Cray took off his left leg below the knee and sent shrapnel screaming through our formation. The blast was followed immediately by las fire from concealed positions in the facility's upper levels. Not the precise shots of trained soldiers, but the desperate volleys of people fighting for their lives. My response was automatic, driven by training that had become instinct. I dove for cover behind an ore conveyor belt, shouldered my lasgun, and began returning fire at muzzle flashes in the overhead gantries. The familiar weight of the weapon in my hands, the satisfying snap hiss of las bolts leaving the barrel, the practice sequence of aim fire acquire new target felt as natural as breathing. It wasn't until the firefight ended and we advanced through the positions we had just taken that I saw what my adequate marksmanship performance had actually accomplished. The miner I had killed was maybe 16 years old, barely old enough to qualify for adult work assignment. The las bolt had taken him center mass, burning through his civilian clothing and flesh with the efficient lethality that made lasguns the preferred weapon of the Imperial Guard. He had died clutching a mining laser that had been modified to function as a crude weapon, dangerous at close range, but virtually useless against trained soldiers with proper equipment. Looking down at his body, I felt something fundamental shift inside my mind. This wasn't a Xenos warrior or a Chaos cultist, or any of the galaxy-threatening enemies that our training had prepared us to face. This was a scared kid with improvised weapons who had probably never seen real combat before today. And I had killed him efficiently, professionally, with the same casual competence that I might have applied to any other assigned task. "Good shooting, Guardsman," Squad Leader Kane said as he approached my position. "Clean center mass hit, immediate incapacitation, minimal collateral damage, exactly what the training manuals prescribe for this type of engagement." The advance through Residential Complex Delta was a methodical progression from one atrocity to the next. The rebels had fortified themselves in the worker housing blocks, turning individual habitation units into defensive positions connected by improvised tunnel networks. Our orders were to clear each block systematically, ensuring that no resistance elements remained to threaten the restoration of normal operations. What this meant in practice was kicking down the doors of people's homes and shooting anyone who appeared to be armed, potentially armed, or simply unwilling to surrender immediately. The distinction between combatants and civilians became meaningless when anyone over the age of 12 might be carrying a tool that could be used as a weapon. In Hab Block 47, we found a family that had barricaded themselves into their small living space, a mining supervisor named Henrik Voss, his wife Elena, and their 3 children ranging in age from 7 to 15. Henrik was armed with a shotgun that had probably been issued to him as part of his supervisory responsibilities. But he had never pointed it at another human being, and his hands shook so badly he couldn't maintain a proper grip. "Please," Elena Voss begged as our squad surrounded their position. "We're not rebels. We just want to protect our children. We were trying to surrender when the shooting started." Squad leader Kane evaluated the situation with the kind of tactical thinking that our training had emphasized. Armed civilian in fortified position, potential threat to squad safety, unclear loyalty status. The manual response was obvious. "Henrik Voss, you are in violation of Imperial law by bearing arms against lawful authority," Kane announced. "Drop your weapon immediately and submit to pacification forces." Henrik's response was to raise the shotgun toward our position. Not aimed, not threatening, just the reflexive movement of someone whose terrified mind was no longer processing instructions clearly. It was exactly the kind of movement that our training had taught us to interpret as hostile action requiring immediate response. The volley of las fire that cut down the entire family lasted approximately 3 seconds. Clinical, efficient, tactically sound according to every standard we had been taught. But as I looked down at the body of the 7-year-old girl, who had been standing behind her father when we opened fire, I understood that something irreversible had happened to me. The person who had been drafted 6 months ago would have been horrified by what I had just participated in. The person I had become saw it as an unfortunate but necessary aspect of maintaining Imperial authority. The pacification of mining colony Zerion 7 was completed within 18 hours of our initial deployment. Final casualty statistics: 347 colonial civilians dead, 89 wounded, 156 detained for processing by Imperial authorities. Imperial Guard losses: 12 dead, 34 wounded, all from newly graduated units lacking combat experience. The official after-action report classified the operation as a complete success. Order had been restored, production quotas would resume, and the example set by the colony's fate would serve as a deterrent to similar rebellions throughout the sector. But that night, sitting in our temporary barracks while the colony's industrial machinery was restarted under the supervision of replacement administrators, I tried to understand what had happened to me over the previous 6 months. I could still remember being Jarn Kellec, factory worker of Hive Secundus. I could still access those memories, still recall what it felt like to worry about protein rations and work assignments and all the mundane concerns of civilian life. But those memories felt like they belonged to someone else, some naive person who hadn't understood the true nature of the galaxy or his place in it. The person I had become understood that the Imperium's survival required difficult choices, that maintaining order across millions of worlds meant sometimes using force against people who challenged that order, that individual lives, including my own, were less important than the greater good of humanity's continued existence. It was a rational, logical, perfectly reasonable worldview. It was also a worldview that could watch children die and classify their deaths as acceptable casualties in the maintenance of Imperial authority. Guardsman Davek Kane, who had transitioned from gang enforcer to squad leader with frightening efficiency, sat down beside me as I was cleaning my lasgun for the 3rd time that evening. "Having second thoughts?" he asked, though his tone suggested that second thoughts were a luxury we could no longer afford. "I was thinking about the girl," I replied. "The one in Hab Block 47. She was younger than some of the kids who used to play in the corridors outside my Hab unit back on Secundus." Kane nodded slowly. Yeah, I saw her too. But you know what? If we hadn't taken down that position, if Henrik Voss had gotten off a lucky shot, one of us would be dead instead of them. Maybe you, maybe me, maybe someone else whose family will never know what happened to them. He was right, of course. The tactical situation had required immediate action, and immediate action had saved Imperial lives at the cost of colonial lives. It was a perfectly reasonable calculation, according to every standard we had been trained to apply. Besides, Kane continued, what do you think would have happened to those kids if the rebellion had succeeded? You think they would have lived better lives as citizens of an independent mining colony? The orcs would have eaten them, or the chaos cults would have sacrificed them, or they would have starved to death when the colony's life support systems broke down without Imperial maintenance. Again, he was right. The galaxy was full of threats that made Imperial rule seem merciful by comparison. The civilians we had killed today would have died anyway, probably more painfully and certainly more meaninglessly. It was a perfectly logical argument. It was also the kind of argument that could justify almost anything, as long as you were willing to accept that the Imperium's version of order was the only alternative to chaos. Our graduation ceremony took place the following morning in the colony's main industrial complex, with the restored mining equipment providing a backdrop for the formal transition from trainees to active guard personnel. Colonel Vane presented each of us with our regimental insignia and assignment orders, while Commissar Corrin delivered a speech about our successful completion of training and our readiness to serve the Emperor's cause throughout the galaxy. You came here as civilians, Corrin announced as we stood at attention in our dress uniforms, and you leave here as Imperial Guardsmen. You have proven your courage under fire, your dedication to duty, and your understanding of what service to the Imperium truly requires. The galaxy is a dangerous place, filled with enemies who would destroy everything human civilization has achieved. You are now part of the force that stands between humanity and extinction. My assignment orders directed me to report to the 47th Cadian Shock Regiment, currently deployed in the Segmentum solar conducting operations against Orc raiders in the Outer System territories. It was considered a prestigious assignment. The Cadian regiments were known throughout the Imperium for their professionalism and effectiveness. As our transport ship prepared to depart mining colony Zarian 7 for the next phase of our military careers, I looked back at the industrial complex where I had learned what it really meant to be a soldier. The mining operations were already returning to full capacity under the supervision of replacement administrators. The dead had been processed according to standard burial protocols, and the survivors were returning to their assigned duties with the kind of resigned compliance that characterized life throughout the Imperium. Everything was exactly as it should be, according to Imperial standards. Order had been maintained, authority had been respected, and the galaxy's most important resource, human labor, continued to flow toward the purposes that the Imperium's leadership deemed appropriate. But somewhere in the back of my mind, a small voice that sounded like the person I used to be was asking questions that I no longer wanted to answer. Questions about whether maintaining order was worth any price. Questions about whether authority deserved respect simply because it existed. Questions about whether the greater good was really served by turning ordinary people into efficient killers and then unleashing them on anyone who challenged the system. I pushed those questions down into the deepest corners of my consciousness, where they joined all the other doubts and concerns that had no place in the mind of a professional soldier. I had a duty to perform, orders to follow, and a galaxy full of enemies who needed to be killed in service of humanity's survival. Everything else was just noise. Chapter 4. The Grinding War. The Orc incursion into the Mordian system had been in progress for 8 months when the 47th Cadian Shock Regiment arrived to reinforce the beleaguered Imperial defenses. From the observation deck of our transport ship, the fourth planet looked like a world at war. Orbital defense platforms exchanging fire with ramshackle Orc vessels, burning debris falling through the atmosphere like metal rain, and the constant flicker of explosions that marked where the fighting was heaviest. Colonel Mordian Thorne, commanding officer of the 47th Cadian, briefed our regiment during the final approach to the planetary surface. Standing before a holographic display that showed the current tactical situation, he presented the kind of clinical analysis that had become familiar during my months of service. The Orcs have established a significant foothold in the northern continent's industrial sector, he explained, indicating areas on the map where green symbols showed enemy concentrations. Intelligence estimates place their numbers at approximately 500,000 combat-capable greenskins, supported by their usual collection of improvised vehicles, crude artillery, and captured Imperial equipment. The numbers were staggering. 500,000 Orcs was enough to devastate an entire sector if left unchecked, but it was also exactly the kind of challenge that the Imperial Guard was designed to handle. Throw enough human bodies at the problem, supported by adequate firepower and competent leadership, and eventually even the largest Orc war could be ground down to manageable proportions. Our mission is to establish and maintain a defensive perimeter around the primary hive city, while Imperial Navy assets conduct orbital bombardment of confirmed Orc positions. Colonel Thorne continued. This will be a war of attrition, gentlemen. The Orcs are numerous, aggressive, and completely without fear. But they lack organization, discipline, and the ability to conduct coordinated operations beyond the tactical level. He paused, scanning our assembled company commanders with the kind of steady gaze that suggested he had seen this type of operation many times before. We will bleed them. Every day, every engagement, every assault they launch against our positions will cost them more casualties than they can afford to sustain. Eventually, their war boss will be killed, their hierarchy will collapse, and the survivors will fragment into smaller groups that can be hunted down individually. It was a strategy that had been proven effective across thousands of similar campaigns throughout Imperial history. The only problem was that it required the Imperial Guard to absorb enormous casualties while slowly grinding down a numerically superior enemy force. My first real taste of prolonged combat came 3 days after planetfall, when our company was assigned to defend Checkpoint Theta 7, a critical road junction that controlled access to the Hive City's primary water treatment facility. The position consisted of reinforced concrete bunkers connected by trenches, with overlapping fields of fire that could turn the surrounding area into a killing ground for any force attempting to advance on the Hive. It should have been a textbook defensive position. The problem was that Orcs didn't follow textbook tactics. The first assault came at dawn on our 4th day in position, preceded by a bombardment from Orc artillery pieces that were clearly built from salvaged Imperial equipment. The incoming shells were inaccurate but devastating when they hit, turning sections of our defensive line into craters filled with shattered concrete and body parts. Then came the Orcs themselves. Nothing in our training had adequately prepared us for the reality of facing a greenskin assault. The creatures that emerged from the morning mist were 3 meters tall and built like living tanks, their green skin marked with scars and crude tattoos that proclaimed their allegiance to their war boss. They carried weapons that looked like they had been assembled from scrap metal and industrial machinery, but they hit like proper artillery when they connected. The sound they made as they charged our positions was unlike anything in human experience. Part war cry, part mechanical roar, part expression of pure joy at the prospect of violence. They came forward in a wave that seemed to stretch from horizon to horizon, their crude vehicles bouncing across the broken ground, while massive Orc infantry formations followed behind. All units, this is Checkpoint Theta 7, I transmitted on the company command frequency as I watched the approaching horde through my scope. We are receiving contact from approximately 2,000 Orc infantry, supported by light vehicles and mobile artillery, requesting immediate fire support. The response came from Lieutenant Hadron Vex, our company commander, in a voice that carried the kind of calm that comes from professional competence. Negative on the fire support, Guardsman Kellec. Naval assets are engaged with Orc air superiority fighters. You are authorized to conduct fighting withdrawal to secondary positions if your position becomes untenable. Fighting withdrawal. Military terminology for run away when they get too close, but phrased in language that preserved the illusion of tactical sophistication. The first wave hit our outer perimeter with the subtlety of an avalanche. Orc infantry swarmed over our wire obstacles and minefields, absorbing casualties that would have broken any human formation, but simply driving the survivors forward with increased enthusiasm. Their return fire was wildly inaccurate, but so voluminous that the air above our trenches became lethal to anything not behind solid cover. I burned through 3 power cells in the first 10 minutes of fighting, firing controlled bursts at targets that seemed to absorb lasgun hits without noticeable effect. The orcs were tough beyond human comprehension, creatures that could take multiple center mass hits and keep advancing, roaring their alien war cries as they closed the distance to our positions. Guardsman Marcus Kell, who had been assigned to the heavy weapons squad after demonstrating exceptional marksmanship during training, managed to bring down several orcs with sustained fire from his squad's heavy bolter. But for every greenskin that fell, 2 more seemed to take its place, and our ammunition situation was becoming critical. "Guardsman Kellec, this is Lieutenant Vex," came the transmission that I had been expecting. "You are ordered to commence fighting withdrawal to Rally Point Delta. Maintain unit cohesion and cover your wounded." The withdrawal from Checkpoint Theta 7 was a masterpiece of Imperial Guard tactical doctrine, a disciplined movement that preserved unit integrity while minimizing casualties and maintaining the ability to engage pursuing enemy forces. We leapfrogged from position to position, covering each other's movement while calling in what artillery support was available to slow the orc advance. It was also a complete strategic defeat that cost us control of the water treatment facility and left an entire sector of the Hive City vulnerable to orc assault. But in the mathematics of attrition warfare, strategic defeats were acceptable as long as they inflicted disproportionate casualties on the enemy. According to our post-action reports, the defense of Checkpoint Theta 7 had cost the orcs approximately 400 casualties in exchange for 23 Imperial Guard dead and 67 wounded. It was considered a significant tactical victory. The pattern that defined the Mordian campaign became clear over the following months. Orc assaults that cost them hundreds of casualties, Imperial withdrawals that preserved our forces while yielding territory, artillery duels that consumed vast quantities of ammunition while achieving minimal strategic results, and the slow, grinding process of wearing down an enemy that seemed to enjoy the experience of being worn down. By the 3rd month of the campaign, I had been promoted to squad leader after my previous sergeant was killed by orc sniper fire. By the 6th month, I was acting platoon commander due to officer casualties. By the 8th month, I was one of the senior non-commissioned officers in a company that had been rebuilt 4 times since planetfall. The promotions came not because of exceptional performance or tactical brilliance, but simply because I had survived longer than most of my peers. In the Imperial Guard, longevity was often the most important qualification for leadership positions. Leading other guardsmen into combat was different from simply following orders. Now I was responsible not just for my own survival, but for making decisions that would determine whether the people under my command lived or died. The weight of that responsibility was crushing in ways that no training could have prepared me for. "Kellec, we've got movement in Sector 7, reported Guardsman Eleanor Vash, who served as my platoon's forward observer. "Looks like a probing attack, maybe 30 orcs with light vehicles." I studied the tactical display on my command Vox unit, evaluating the threat against our current position and available resources. 30 orcs was manageable for a full-strength platoon, but my unit was down to 18 effectives after the previous week's fighting. "Can we get artillery support?" I asked. "Negative," Vash replied. "All fire missions are being directed against the main orc concentration in Sector 12. We're on our own for this one." The decision I made in the next few seconds would determine whether my platoon held its position or conducted another tactical withdrawal that yielded more ground to the enemy. But it would also determine whether 18 people who had followed me through months of combat would be going home to their families, or dying in service to a strategic objective that might not even matter in the larger scheme of the campaign. "All units, this is platoon command," I transmitted on the local frequency. "We will hold current positions and engage targets of opportunity. Remember your training, conserve ammunition, and watch your sectors of fire. The Emperor protects." The engagement that followed was typical of hundreds of similar actions throughout the Mordian campaign. A brief, violent exchange of fire that left several orcs dead and cost us 2 wounded guardsmen who would be evacuated to medical facilities and eventually returned to their home worlds as casualties of war. But what made this engagement different was that it was the first time I had chosen to fight rather than retreat. The first time I had decided that holding ground was worth risking the lives of people who trusted me to make the right decision. The orcs were driven off. Our position remained secure, and the tactical situation was marginally improved by our successful defense. According to every standard that the Imperial Guard used to evaluate combat performance, my decision had been correct. But that night, as I filled out casualty reports for Guardsmen Thorn and Valdris, who had been wounded by orc gunfire, I wondered whether there was any meaningful difference between the tactical victories we were achieving and the strategic defeats we were suffering. We were winning every engagement while slowly losing the war. We were inflicting casualties on the enemy while gradually being pushed back toward the hive city that we were supposed to be defending. We were following doctrine perfectly while watching the orc forces grow stronger and more coordinated with each passing week. The breakthrough came during the 10th month of the campaign, when Warboss Scarfang was finally killed by an Imperial Navy orbital strike that turned his command bunker into a crater visible from orbit. Within hours, the carefully coordinated orc offensive collapsed into dozens of smaller raids as different factions began fighting each other for control of the War's remaining resources. The final phase of the Mordian campaign was a systematic mopping up operation that took another 6 weeks to complete. Individual orc bands were hunted down and eliminated by Imperial Guard forces that finally outnumbered their enemies. The few remaining greenskin strongholds were reduced by concentrated artillery bombardment. The threat to the Mordian system was eliminated with the kind of thorough efficiency that characterized successful Imperial military operations. Final casualty statistics for the 47th Cadian Shock Regiment: 2,047 killed in action, 6,234 wounded in action, 89 missing in action, 156 invalided out of service due to combat injuries. Out of the original 8,000 guardsmen who had deployed to Mordian, fewer than 700 were still fit for frontline duty by the end of the campaign. But we had won. The orcs were dead, the system was secure, and another threat to Imperial authority had been eliminated through the proper application of military force. The victory celebration took place in the ruins of what had once been the Hive City's primary commercial district, with the surviving members of our regiment assembled to receive commendations and promotions that recognized their service during the campaign. Colonel Thorn, who had somehow survived 10 months of combat that killed most of his senior staff, presented medals and citations with the kind of formal ceremony that maintained military traditions even in the aftermath of near-total unit destruction. "Guardsmen of the 47th Cadian," he announced, as we stood at attention among the rubble and blast craters that marked where the fighting had been heaviest. "You have demonstrated the finest traditions of Imperial Guard service. Through your courage, discipline, and dedication to duty, you have achieved victory against overwhelming odds and preserved Imperial authority in the Mordian system." I received the Imperial Infantryman's Uplifting Primer Medal for exceptional leadership under fire and tactical innovation in the face of superior enemy forces. The citation mentioned my role in 17 separate engagements and credited me with maintaining unit cohesion and fighting effectiveness throughout extended combat operations. It was a significant honor, the kind of recognition that marked a guardsman for promotion to senior non-commissioned officer ranks and potential selection for officer training. But as I stood there listening to Colonel Thorn's speech about duty and sacrifice and the Emperor's protection, all I could think about were the faces of the people who hadn't lived to attend the ceremony. Marcus Kell, killed by artillery fire during the defense of Processing Station Alpha. Elena Vash, who had volunteered for a reconnaissance mission that turned into a suicide run when her squad was surrounded by orc raiders. Davik Kane, who had finally found something he was genuinely good at just before a greenskin sniper put a bullet through his head. They were all good soldiers, competent people who had followed orders and done their duty according to every standard the Imperial Guard recognized. But they were also dead. reduced to casualty statistics and memorial plaques that would be forgotten as soon as the regiment received its next deployment orders. The 47th Cadian was scheduled for reconstruction and redeployment within 3 months, with replacement personnel drawn from recruiting worlds throughout the sector and veteran survivors serving as the backbone around which new units would be built. I would be part of that backbone, using my combat experience to train the next generation of guardsmen who would fight and die in service to the Imperium's endless military needs. It was an honor, a recognition of professional competence, and a guarantee that I would spend the rest of my life watching young people learn to kill and be killed with the kind of mechanical efficiency that kept the Imperium functioning. As our transport ship departed the Mordian system for our next assignment, I looked back at the planet where I had learned what it meant to be a real soldier. The industrial facilities were already being rebuilt. The civilian population was returning to normal production schedules, and the Orc threat was just another entry in the sector's military history. Everything was exactly as it should be, according to Imperial standards. Victory had been achieved, order had been maintained, and the galaxy's most important resource, human lives, continued to flow toward whatever purposes the Imperium's leadership deemed appropriate. But somewhere in the back of my mind, that small voice that sounded like the person I used to be was asking new questions. Questions about whether victory was worth any price. Questions about whether order deserved protection if it could only be maintained through constant violence. Questions about whether the human lives being spent in the Emperor's name were actually achieving anything meaningful or just perpetuating a cycle of endless war. I pushed those questions down into the deepest corners of my consciousness, where they joined all the other doubts that had no place in the mind of a professional soldier, but they were getting harder to ignore. Chapter 5. The Long Watch. 23 years after my conscription, I stood on the command deck of Firebase Echo 9 and watched another generation of fresh recruits learn to die for the Emperor's glory. The planet was Calyx Prime, a strategically insignificant agri-world in the Segmentum Tempestus that had attracted the attention of a splinter Tyranid hive fleet. Not a major incursion, just enough bioforms to threaten the agricultural production that fed a dozen nearby systems. The kind of small-scale conflict that the Imperial Guard handled routinely, with minimal fanfare and acceptable casualties. I was Sergeant Major Jarn Kellec now, senior non-commissioned officer of the 47th Cadian's 3rd Battalion, responsible for training and discipline across 4 companies of guardsmen whose average age was 19. Most of them had never seen real combat. Most of them still believed that military service was about heroism and honor rather than efficient mass murder in support of bureaucratic objectives. They would learn better if they lived long enough. "Sergeant Major," called Lieutenant Helena Voss, the young officer who had been assigned as my current company commander after her predecessor was killed by a Tyranid warrior during our first week on Calyx Prime. "The Tau communication is coming through on the command frequency." I activated the tactical display, studying the force disposition that showed our current situation with the kind of clinical precision that had become second nature after decades of military service. The Tyranid splinter fleet had established a significant foothold in the planet's northern agricultural zones, consuming biomass and reproducing at the exponential rate that made them one of the galaxy's most dangerous threats. But more immediately concerning was the Tau expeditionary force that had arrived in system 3 days ago, ostensibly offering to assist with the Tyranid extermination, but actually pursuing their own strategic objectives in the region. The Xenos were professional soldiers, well-equipped and competently led, but their presence complicated our mission in ways that standard Imperial doctrine didn't adequately address. "Guela Commander," came the transmission in accented but grammatically correct Low Gothic. "This is Chassael Mian of the Firecast Expeditionary Force. We propose coordination of anti-Tyranid operations to maximize efficiency and minimize unnecessary casualties." It was exactly the kind of reasonable suggestion that Imperial regulations forbade me from accepting. Collaboration with Xenos forces was heretical by definition, regardless of tactical advantages or strategic necessity. The official Imperial response to any Xenos offer of cooperation was immediate rejection followed by preparation for hostile engagement. But after 23 years of watching good soldiers die in service to policies that prioritize doctrinal purity over practical effectiveness, I was finding it difficult to summon appropriate enthusiasm for following regulations that guaranteed additional casualties. "Lieutenant Voss," I said quietly, "what's your assessment of the tactical situation if we engage both the Tyranids and the Tau simultaneously?" She activated her data slate, reviewing casualty projections and resource requirements with the kind of methodical analysis that officer training emphasized. "Sergeant Major, current force strength is insufficient for sustained operations against multiple enemy formations. Projected casualties range from 60 to 80% over the next 2 weeks, with low probability of mission success." The mathematics were brutally clear. Following standard Imperial doctrine would result in the effective destruction of our regiment while failing to achieve our primary objective of eliminating the Tyranid threat. But cooperating with Xenos forces, even temporarily, even for tactically sound reasons, was the kind of heresy that could result in commissariat intervention and summary execution. "What do you recommend, Sergeant Major?" Lieutenant Voss asked, and I realized that she was asking me to make a decision that should have been far above my authority level. But that was the reality of Imperial Guard operations. Junior officers died faster than they could be replaced, leaving experienced non-commissioned officers to make strategic decisions while maintaining the fiction that proper chain of command was being followed. I had been making officer-level choices for years while allowing successive lieutenants to sign the paperwork and take credit for successes or blame for failures. "Send a response to the Tau commander," I decided. "Inform them that we are evaluating their proposal and request additional details about their tactical capabilities and operational objectives." It wasn't acceptance of their offer, but it wasn't immediate rejection either. It was exactly the kind of bureaucratic non-commitment that gave me time to think while avoiding immediate violation of regulations. Lieutenant Voss transmitted the message, then looked at me with an expression that suggested she understood the implications of what I was considering. "Sergeant Major, are we actually going to coordinate with Xenos forces?" "We're going to do whatever keeps our people alive and completes the mission," I replied. "Everything else is just politics." The young officer who stood across from me represented everything that was both best and worst about Imperial military culture. She was competent, dedicated, genuinely concerned about the welfare of her troops, and absolutely committed to following regulations that had been written by people who had never faced the tactical situations she was dealing with. In other words, she was exactly like I had been 23 years ago, before experience taught me that survival often required flexibility in one's interpretation of orders. The Tyranid assault on Firebase Echo 9 began at dawn the following day, preceded by the kind of bioelectric interference that made long-range communications impossible and reduced our situational awareness to whatever our sentries could observe directly. The creatures that emerged from the morning mist were a nightmare fusion of organic evolution and predatory efficiency. Gaunts that moved like insects but struck like artillery shells. Larger bioforms that absorbed lasgun fire without apparent effect, and flying organisms that turned the air itself into a weapon. Our defensive positions had been prepared according to standard Imperial Guard doctrine, with overlapping fields of fire and pre-planned artillery strikes that could turn any approach route into a killing ground. But Tyranid tactics didn't follow any pattern that human military theory could predict, and our carefully prepared defenses became increasingly irrelevant as the aliens adapted to our responses in real time. All units, this is Firebase Command," I transmitted on the command frequency as I watched our outer perimeter begin to collapse under alien pressure. "We are receiving heavy contact from Tyranid bioforms. Estimated enemy strength is approximately 5,000 organisms, with continuing reinforcement from hiveship assets." The response came from Colonel Marcus Thorne, commanding officer of our regiment, in a voice that carried 25 years of combat experience. "Understood, Sergeant Major. You are authorized to conduct defensive operations as you see fit. Regimental headquarters is coordinating orbital fire support, but naval assets are engaged with Tyranid spaceborne organisms. In other words, We were on our own until the larger tactical situation stabilized. It was exactly the kind of situation that required commanders to make decisions based on immediate necessities rather than long-term policy considerations. The Tau fire support began just as our ammunition situation was becoming critical. Pulse rifle fire from concealed positions eliminated the larger Tyranid bioforms that our lasguns couldn't penetrate, while Tau drones provided cover for Imperial Guard units conducting tactical withdrawals from untenable positions. The coordination was seamless, professional, and completely effective. It was also completely heretical, according to Imperial doctrine, which meant that everyone involved could be executed for collaboration with Xenos forces if higher authority decided that doctrinal purity was more important than tactical success. Sergeant Major, Lieutenant Voss reported as she monitored communication intercepts from the Tau force. Their commander is requesting permission to deploy fire support assets within our perimeter. He says his crisis suits can provide close-range anti-armor capabilities that will significantly improve our defensive effectiveness. The request made perfect tactical sense. Tau crisis suits were sophisticated weapons platforms that could eliminate the largest Tyranid bioforms with precision strikes, and their deployment within our defensive lines would create an integrated defense that neither force could achieve independently. It was also an explicit violation of every regulation governing Imperial Guard operations, a form of Xenos collaboration that would be considered treason by any commissariat investigation. Tell the Tau commander that his proposal is tactically interesting, I replied. Request detailed specifications for integration procedures and coordination protocols. Again, it wasn't acceptance, but it wasn't rejection either. It was the kind of careful non-commitment that preserved options while avoiding immediate regulatory violations. But as I watched Tyranid organisms tear through defensive positions that had cost us weeks to construct, I realized that preserving options was becoming a luxury we couldn't afford. The aliens were adapting to our tactics faster than we could modify our responses, and our casualty rate was climbing toward levels that would render the unit combat ineffective within hours. The decision I made in the next few minutes would either save my regiment or result in my execution for treason against the Imperium. Lieutenant Voss, I said quietly, transmit acceptance of the Tau proposal. Full tactical coordination, integrated defense protocols, shared target acquisition. And Lieutenant, make sure the communication logs reflect that this decision was made under emergency battlefield conditions with insufficient time for consultation with higher authority. She nodded, understanding that I was creating a paper trail that might protect her from the consequences of my choice. Yes, Sergeant Major, transmitting acceptance now. The integrated human Tau defense of Firebase Echo 9 was the most professionally executed military operation I had participated in during my entire Guard career. Tau crisis suits provided precision fire support that eliminated high-value targets, while Imperial Guard infantry maintained area denial through volume of fire. Tau drones conducted reconnaissance and target designation, while Imperial artillery provided area effect bombardment. Human flexibility and Tau technological sophistication combined to create a defensive system that was greater than the sum of its parts. Within 6 hours, the Tyranid assault had been completely repulsed, with enemy casualties estimated at over 3,000 organisms in exchange for 47 Imperial Guard dead and 23 Tau casualties. It was the kind of lopsided victory that would normally result in commendations and promotion recommendations for everyone involved. Instead, it was the kind of tactical success that would require careful management to avoid heresy charges for all participants. The Tau commander, Shas El Mayen, requested a face-to-face meeting following the successful defense, arriving at our command bunker with an escort of fire warriors whose professional bearing reminded me of veteran Imperial Guard units. The alien himself was tall, blue-skinned, and possessed of the kind of calm confidence that came from competent leadership rather than political authority. Guela Commander, he said as we met in the Firebase's primary briefing chamber. Your forces fought with honor and efficiency. The integration of our tactical capabilities achieved results that neither force could have accomplished independently. I studied the Xenos officer, trying to reconcile his obviously sincere professionalism with everything Imperial doctrine had taught me about alien treachery and the inherent unreliability of non-human allies. But after 6 hours of watching Tau forces risk their own casualties to provide fire support for Imperial positions, it was difficult to maintain the kind of automatic suspicion that regulations required. "Your people fought well also," I replied carefully. "The tactical coordination was effective." "Indeed," which raises an interesting question about future operations in this sector. He activated a holographic display showing the current strategic situation across Kellec's Prime, with Tyranid forces still controlling approximately 30% of the planet's surface. The remaining bioforms will require systematic elimination, but they have demonstrated the ability to adapt to conventional Imperial tactics. Continued cooperation between our forces would significantly improve the probability of mission success. He was right, of course. The Tyranids were learning from every engagement, developing countermeasures to our weapons and tactics, with the kind of rapid evolution that made them nearly impossible to defeat through repetition of proven strategies. But working with the Tau on an ongoing basis would transform temporary battlefield cooperation into systematic collaboration with Xenos forces. It would be heresy on a scale that could result in the entire regiment being declared traitors to the Imperium. "I'll need to consult with my superiors," I said, using the kind of bureaucratic delay tactic that had become second nature during 2 decades of military service. "Of course, but Gwela Commander, I hope you will consider the broader implications of what we have achieved today. Human and Tau, forces working together, sharing resources and capabilities, achieving tactical objectives that benefit both our peoples. Perhaps this could serve as a model for future cooperation." After he left, I sat in the command bunker and tried to understand what had just happened to me. For 23 years, I had followed Imperial doctrine with the kind of automatic obedience that military training required. I had executed orders without question, enforced regulations without exception, and maintained loyalty to the Emperor's cause, even when that loyalty required actions that my conscience questioned. But today, I had chosen tactical effectiveness over doctrinal purity. I had preserved the lives of Imperial citizens by working with Xenos forces. I had achieved victory through cooperation rather than conquest. And for the first time in my military career, I felt like I had done something genuinely meaningful rather than just following orders. The communication from regimental headquarters arrived 6 hours later, transmitted on encrypted channels that indicated the highest level of operational security. Colonel Thorne's voice carried the kind of careful neutrality that suggested he was dealing with politically sensitive information. "Sergeant Major Kellec, initial reports of your defensive action have been reviewed by Sector Command. Your tactical improvisation under extreme battlefield conditions has been noted and appreciated. However, certain aspects of your operational decisions require clarification before final action reports can be filed." In other words, someone with significantly more authority than Colonel Thorne was asking uncomfortable questions about our cooperation with Tau forces, and my career, and possibly my life, depended on how those questions were answered. "Request immediate secure communication conference with Sector Command," I replied. "I am prepared to provide complete tactical justification for all battlefield decisions." The conference that followed would determine whether the most professionally successful operation of my military career would be classified as heroic innovation or treasonous collaboration with the enemies of mankind. As I prepared my defensive decisions that had saved hundreds of Imperial lives at the cost of violating regulations that had been written by people who had never faced the tactical situations I was dealing with, I realized that my 23 years of faithful service had led me to a choice that defined the rest of my life. I could continue following orders that guaranteed unnecessary casualties in service to doctrinal purity, or I could choose tactical effectiveness even when it required flexibility in my interpretation of Imperial law. Both choices carried risks, but only one of them offered the possibility of something better than the endless cycle of violence that characterized Imperial military operations. For the first time in my career, I was beginning to understand why some people chose to become heretics. Chapter 6. The Weight of Command. The heresy trial began on a Tuesday morning in the sterile chambers of Inquisition Station Gamma Tertius, exactly 47 days after the successful defense of Firebase Echo 9. I stood before a tribunal composed of individuals whose authority derived directly from the Emperor's will. Inquisitor Thaddeus Vaughan of the Ordo Xenos, Commissar General Helena Cass, representing the Imperial Guard's political apparatus, and Lord General Marcus Vane, speaking for Sector Military Command. The charges against me were precise and damning. Collaboration with Xenos forces in violation of Imperial doctrine, unauthorized tactical coordination with alien military units, and conduct prejudicial to the maintenance of human genetic and cultural purity. Each charge carried the potential for summary execution, and together they represented a level of heresy that would normally result in not just my death, but the disbandment and reassignment of every unit under my command. Sergeant Major Jarn Kellec, Inquisitor Vaughan announced as he reviewed the case files, "You stand accused of violations so severe that they threaten the fundamental principles upon which the Imperium is founded. How do you answer these charges?" I had spent 47 days preparing for this moment, consulting with regimental legal advocates, and reviewing every precedent I could find for battlefield cooperation with Xenos forces. The tactical justifications were solid, the strategic results were undeniable, and the precedent existed for emergency exceptions to standard doctrine when human lives were at stake. But I had also spent 47 days thinking about the broader implications of what I had done, and I had reached conclusions that went far beyond legal technicalities. Inquisitor, I answered that I followed the highest duty of any Imperial servant. I preserved human lives and achieved tactical objectives in service to humanity's survival, I replied. Every decision I made during the defense of Firebase Echo 9 was consistent with the fundamental purpose of Imperial military doctrine, even when it required tactical flexibility in the application of specific regulations. It was a carefully worded response that acknowledged the charges while reframing them in terms of larger Imperial priorities. But as I spoke, I realized that my real defense had nothing to do with legal precedents or regulatory interpretations. My real defense was that I had discovered something during the cooperation with Tau forces that challenged everything I had been taught about the nature of the galaxy and humanity's place in it. Commissar General Cass leaned forward in her chair, studying me with the kind of intense scrutiny that political officers use to evaluate loyalty and ideological reliability. Sergeant Major, are you suggesting that cooperation with Xenos forces can be justified on military grounds, regardless of the broader implications for Imperial doctrine and human purity? The question was a trap, designed to elicit a response that could be classified as heretical thinking rather than tactical improvisation. But after 23 years of military service and 47 days of reflection, I had developed a perspective that transcended the simple categories of orthodoxy and heresy. Commissar General, I'm suggesting that human survival requires us to be smarter than our enemies, more adaptable than our doctrine, and more committed to results than to process, I replied. The Tau forces that assisted in our defense were professional soldiers fighting for tactically sound reasons. Refusing their assistance would have cost hundreds of Imperial lives without achieving any meaningful strategic advantage. Lord General Vane activated a holographic display showing the final casualty statistics from the Calix Prime campaign. Sergeant Major, the record shows that your tactical innovations resulted in a 73% reduction in projected casualties and a 300% improvement in mission completion time. From a purely military standpoint, your decisions were remarkably effective. He paused, and I could see him weighing political considerations against operational realities. However, effectiveness is not the only standard by which Imperial military decisions are evaluated. Doctrinal compliance, ideological purity, and adherence to established precedent are equally important factors in maintaining the Imperium's unity and stability. It was exactly the kind of response I had expected from senior Imperial leadership. Acknowledgement of tactical success combined with concern about broader implications. But as I listened to his words, I realized that my 47 days of preparation had led me to a conclusion that would determine the rest of my life. I was no longer willing to pretend that doctrinal compliance was more important than human survival. Lord General, I said, abandoning the careful diplomatic language I had planned to use. With respect, I have spent 23 years watching good soldiers die in service to regulations that prioritize process over results. I have seen competent officers make decisions that guaranteed unnecessary casualties because those decisions were doctrinally correct. I have participated in operations that achieved tactical success at strategic costs that could have been avoided through simple tactical flexibility. The chamber went silent, and I could see the tribunal members exchanging glances that suggested I had just crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. "Are you saying that Imperial doctrine is flawed, Sergeant Major?" Inquisitor Vaughn asked, his voice carrying the kind of deadly calm that preceded summary execution for heretical statements. The honest answer to that question would seal my fate, but after 47 days of reflection, I had decided that honesty was more important than survival. "Inquisitor, I am saying that any doctrine that prevents us from preserving human lives and achieving tactical objectives is a doctrine that serves our enemies rather than the Emperor's will," I replied. The Tau forces that fought beside us at Firebase Echo 9 demonstrated competence, professionalism, and genuine concern for minimizing casualties. They were more effective allies than most Imperial units I have served with. The words hung in the air like a death sentence, and I could see Commissar General Cass making notes that would undoubtedly be used to justify whatever punishment the tribunal decided to impose. But I wasn't finished. "Furthermore," I continued, "I believe that the Imperium's survival depends on our ability to learn from our enemies rather than simply destroying them. The Tau have developed tactical innovations, technological capabilities, and organizational structures that could significantly improve Imperial military effectiveness. Refusing to acknowledge their capabilities or to cooperate with them when tactical situations warrant it is a form of willful ignorance that serves no one except the galaxy's most dangerous threats." Inquisitor Vaughn studied me with the kind of attention that suggested he was trying to determine whether I was a dangerous heretic or simply a delusional soldier who had spent too long in combat zones. "Sergeant Major," he said finally, "what you are describing is not tactical flexibility. It is fundamental rejection of the principles that have sustained the Imperium for 10,000 years. You are suggesting that human civilization should adapt itself to accommodate Xenos influences, rather than maintaining the purity that has preserved our species through the galaxy's darkest ages." "No, Inquisitor," I replied. "I am suggesting that human civilization should be smart enough to learn from anyone who can teach us something useful, regardless of their species or political affiliation. The Imperium's greatest strength has always been its ability to adapt and overcome. But that adaptability has been constrained by regulations that prevent us from using every available resource in service to human survival." The debate that followed consumed the next 6 hours and covered questions that went to the heart of Imperial ideology. Was human purity more important than human survival? Was doctrinal compliance more valuable than tactical effectiveness? Could the Imperium maintain its unity and purpose while adopting innovations from Xenos sources? But gradually, as the tribunal members reviewed the evidence and testimony, a different picture began to emerge. The Tau cooperation at Firebase Echo 9 hadn't just been tactically effective, it had demonstrated possibilities for human development that standard Imperial doctrine actively prevented. "Sergeant Major," Lord General Vane said during one of the breaks in testimony, "suppose for a moment that your tactical innovations were to be officially sanctioned. What would be the broader implications for Imperial military operations?" It was the question I had been hoping for, the opportunity to present the vision that had been developing in my mind during 47 days of reflection on what I had experienced. "Lord General, I believe that selective cooperation with compatible Xenos forces could significantly improve Imperial tactical capabilities while preserving human autonomy and cultural identity," I replied. "The key would be maintaining clear command structures, limited operational scope, and strict protocols for information security. But the potential benefits, in terms of both reduced casualties and improved effectiveness, could be substantial. And the risks? The risks of cooperation are significant but manageable," I admitted. "The risks of continued isolation are potentially catastrophic. The galaxy is becoming more dangerous, our enemies are becoming more sophisticated, and our current tactical approaches are barely adequate to maintain Imperial territory, much less expand it. Commissar General Cass leaned back in her chair, studying me with an expression that suggested she was evaluating implications beyond the scope of my specific case. Sergeant Major, what you are proposing would require fundamental changes to Imperial doctrine, military training, and political oversight. It would affect every aspect of how the Imperium conducts military operations. Yes, ma'am, I replied. But the alternative is to continue fighting the galaxy's threats with one hand tied behind our backs, sacrificing human lives to preserve regulations that may no longer serve their intended purpose. The verdict, when it came, was unlike anything I had expected. Sergeant Major Jarn Kellec, Inquisitor Vaughn announced as the tribunal reconvened for final judgment. This tribunal finds that your actions during the defense of Firebase Echo 9 constituted tactical innovation under extreme combat conditions rather than heretical collaboration with Xenos forces. However, the broader implications of your perspective require careful consideration and ongoing evaluation. I felt relief flooding through me, but Vaughn's next words made it clear that the situation was more complex than simple acquittal. Therefore, you are hereby assigned to a special research unit tasked with developing protocols for limited tactical cooperation with selected Xenos forces under specific emergency conditions. Your military rank and service record remain intact, but your new assignment will be classified at the highest levels of Imperial security. In other words, I was being assigned to develop the very innovations I had advocated, but under conditions that would allow the Imperium to disavow my work if it proved politically problematic. The Special Research Unit turned out to be one of the most fascinating assignments of my military career. Working alongside xenobiologists, tactical analysts, and political theorists, I spent the next 3 years developing protocols for what became known as emergency tactical cooperation, carefully defined circumstances under which Imperial forces could work with Xenos allies without violating fundamental doctrinal principles. The work required balancing military effectiveness against political reality, tactical innovation against ideological consistency, practical necessity against regulatory compliance. But gradually, we developed frameworks that could accommodate limited cooperation while preserving Imperial authority and human autonomy. More importantly, the research convinced me that the Imperium's survival might depend on its ability to evolve beyond the rigid orthodoxy that had defined its first 10,000 years of existence. But that evolution would require leaders willing to risk their careers and their lives in service to possibilities that extended beyond current doctrine. As I completed my final report on emergency tactical cooperation protocols, I realized that my 26 years of Imperial Guard service had led me to a conclusion that would have been unthinkable when I was first conscripted. The Emperor's greatest service to humanity might be preparing us for a future where his absolute authority was no longer necessary. It was a heretical thought that could justify summary execution if spoken aloud. But it was also a thought that offered hope for something better than the endless cycle of violence that characterized Imperial civilization. And after 26 years of watching good people die in service to bad decisions, hope was the most valuable thing I could imagine. Chapter 7. The Teacher's Burden. 35 years after my conscription, I stood before the newest intake of recruits at the Imperial Guard Officer Training Academy on Scholastica Tertius, and saw myself at 19, eager, terrified, and completely unprepared for the realities of military service. The academy was different now, shaped by 3 decades of tactical innovations and doctrinal reforms that had emerged from research programs like the one I had helped develop. Emergency tactical cooperation was now taught as standard curriculum. Xenobiology was a required course for all officer candidates, and adaptive strategy had replaced rigid doctrine as the foundation of Imperial military education. But the young men and women seated in the lecture hall were fundamentally the same as every generation before them. Human beings trying to understand their place in a galaxy that seemed designed to crush individual hopes and dreams beneath the weight of cosmic necessity. Cadets, I began, my voice carrying the authority that came from decades of combat experience and classified research. My name is Colonel Jarn Kellec, And I am here to teach you something that may save your lives and the lives of the people you will command. I am here to teach you that survival often requires choices that your training has not prepared you to make. The faces looking back at me showed the mixture of attention and skepticism that characterized military students throughout the Imperium. They had been trained to follow doctrine, to respect authority, and to trust that their superiors understood the larger context of whatever orders they were given. They had not been trained to think for themselves, to question assumptions, or to adapt when their instructions proved inadequate to the situations they faced. Today, we will discuss the Battle of Firebase Echo 9, I continued, activating a holographic display that showed the tactical situation I had faced 35 years earlier. This engagement is studied throughout the Imperium as an example of innovative tactical cooperation under extreme combat conditions. What the official records don't mention is that the innovations were developed in real time by junior personnel who chose effectiveness over compliance. I paused, studying their faces as they tried to understand what I was really telling them. In other words, the tactics that are now part of standard Imperial doctrine were originally violations of Imperial doctrine, implemented by soldiers who decided that saving lives was more important than following regulations. The silence that followed was profound. These young officer candidates had been raised on stories of imperial glory and unwavering adherence to the Emperor's will. The suggestion that doctrine might sometimes require violation was exactly the kind of heretical thinking that their entire educational background had trained them to reject. Cadet Marcus Vell, a young man whose family had served in the Imperial Guard for 6 generations, raised his hand tentatively. "Colonel, are you suggesting that junior officers should feel free to ignore orders when they disagree with them?" It was exactly the right question, and exactly the kind of trap that made teaching military ethics so challenging. "Cadet Vell, I am suggesting that officers must understand the difference between orders and objectives," I replied. "Your orders tell you what to do. Your objectives tell you what to accomplish. Sometimes following your orders will prevent you from achieving your objectives. And in those situations, you must decide which is more important, compliance or results." I activated a new section of the display, showing casualty projections for the Firebase Echo 9 engagement under different tactical scenarios. If I had followed standard doctrine during the Tyrannid assault, projected casualties would have been 800 Imperial Guard dead and mission failure. By cooperating with Tau forces, in violation of explicit regulations, actual casualties were 47 Imperial Guard dead and complete mission success. Which outcome better serves the Emperor's will? Cadet Elena Voss, whose academic record indicated exceptional analytical capabilities, spoke up from the back of the lecture hall. "Colonel, doesn't unauthorized cooperation with Xenos forces create risks that extend beyond any single tactical engagement? What about the broader implications for Imperial unity and doctrinal consistency?" Another excellent question, and one that got to the heart of why military education required more than just tactical training. "Cadet Voss, you are absolutely correct that tactical decisions can have strategic implications," I acknowledged. "But you must also consider that rigid adherence to doctrine can have strategic implications as well. The question is not whether your decisions will have consequences. They always will. The question is whether those consequences serve your larger objectives." I changed the display again, showing the broader strategic situation in the Segmentum Tempestus following the successful cooperation with Tau forces at Firebase Echo 9. Following my unauthorized tactical innovations, Imperial Tau cooperation has been tested in 17 separate engagements, with a cumulative casualty reduction of 67% and a mission success rate of 100%. Those results have led to formal diplomatic protocols that have prevented 3 separate sector-wide conflicts and saved an estimated 2.3 million Imperial lives. The numbers were impressive, but I could see in their faces that the cadets were struggling with the fundamental challenge of military leadership. How do you serve an institution while simultaneously working to improve it? The lesson here is not that you should ignore orders whenever convenient, I continued. The lesson is that effective leadership requires understanding the purpose behind your orders and making decisions that serve that purpose even when circumstances require tactical adaptability. I paused, meeting the gaze of each cadet in turn. You will face situations where doctrine provides no guidance, where your training is inadequate to the challenges you encounter, and where the right decision requires you to choose between competing values that are equally important. In those moments, you must remember that your primary obligation is not to regulations or precedent, but to the human beings whose lives depend on your choices. The discussion that followed consumed the rest of the morning and extended into the afternoon meal period. These young officer candidates asked questions that went to the heart of imperial military culture. How could individual innovation be balanced against institutional unity? How could tactical flexibility coexist with strategic consistency? How could human values be preserved within a military system that often seemed to treat human lives as expendable resources? The questions were important because they had no simple answers. Military leadership in the 41st millennium required navigating contradictions that had no clean resolution, making choices between competing goods rather than between obvious right and wrong. But gradually, I could see understanding beginning to emerge in their faces. Not the automatic compliance that traditional military education emphasized, but the kind of thoughtful engagement that produced leaders capable of adapting to situations their training had never anticipated. During the afternoon session, I introduced them to case studies from across the Imperium, situations where rigid adherence to doctrine had produced disaster, and situations where tactical innovation had achieved impossible victories. The pattern that emerged was consistent. Effective military leadership required the ability to think strategically while acting tactically, to serve institutional objectives while adapting institutional methods. The Imperial Guard's greatest strength has never been our equipment or our numbers, I explained, as we reviewed the successful defense of Hive Tertius against a chaos incursion. Our greatest strength is our ability to adapt, to learn, and to find solutions to problems that our enemies assume are unsolvable. I activated a new display showing the current strategic situation across the galaxy, with threats from multiple xenospecies, chaos incursions, and emerging challenges that had no historical precedent. The galaxy you will serve in is more complex and dangerous than any previous generation of Imperial officers has faced. The enemies you will fight have access to technologies and tactics that render much of our traditional doctrine obsolete. Your success will depend not on your ability to follow established procedures, but on your ability to develop new procedures that serve established objectives. Cadet Thaddeus Core, whose psychological profile indicated exceptional leadership potential, but concerning tendencies toward independent thinking, asked the question I had been waiting for. Colonel, how do we maintain unit cohesion and institutional loyalty while encouraging the kind of individual initiative you're describing? How do we prevent tactical innovation from becoming institutional chaos? It was the fundamental challenge of military education in the 41st millennium, and the reason why my current assignment was both critical and controversial. Cadet Corps, the answer lies in understanding the difference between means and ends, I replied. Our ends, human survival, imperial security, the protection of civilization, are non-negotiable. Our means, specific tactics, particular strategies, established procedures, must remain flexible enough to adapt when circumstances require change. I paused, considering how to explain concepts that had taken me decades to understand. You maintain unit cohesion by ensuring that everyone understands and commits to your objectives. You maintain institutional loyalty by demonstrating that your innovations serve institutional purposes. You prevent chaos by establishing clear decision-making processes and communication protocols that allow for adaptation while preserving accountability. The final case study I presented was the most challenging: the Imperial response to the emergence of the Tau Empire as a major galactic power. For 40 years, Imperial doctrine had classified the Tau as a minor Xenos threat to be eliminated through conventional military operations. But the Tau's rapid technological development, sophisticated diplomatic capabilities, and adaptive military strategies had made them one of the most significant challenges to Imperial expansion in recent millennia. The Tau represent everything that traditional Imperial doctrine is designed to prevent, I explained. They are Xenos who have achieved technological sophistication that rivals our own, political unity without religious orthodoxy, and military effectiveness without the massive casualties that characterize Imperial operations. I could see some of the cadets shifting uncomfortably as I described capabilities that challenged their assumptions about human superiority and the inevitable triumph of Imperial methods. But rather than simply classifying them as enemies to be destroyed, some Imperial commanders have begun treating them as strategic competitors to be understood and, when appropriate, cooperated with. This approach has led to tactical successes that would have been impossible through conventional military operations. Cadet Voss raised her hand again. Colonel, are you suggesting that the Imperium should adopt TOW methods in place of our own traditions? Not at all, Cadet, I replied. I am suggesting that we should be intelligent enough to learn from anyone who demonstrates effective solutions to problems we are trying to solve. Human values, Imperial objectives, and civilizational priorities remain paramount, but our methods should be sophisticated enough to incorporate useful innovations, regardless of their source. As the day concluded and the cadets prepared to return to their quarters for evening study periods, I reflected on what I was trying to teach them. These young officers would spend the next several decades making decisions that affected millions of lives, determining the fate of worlds, and shaping the future of human civilization. They needed to be more than just competent followers of doctrine. They needed to be adaptive leaders capable of serving Imperial objectives while working to improve Imperial methods. They needed to understand that loyalty to the Imperium sometimes required challenging Imperial assumptions. Most importantly, they needed to remember that behind every tactical decision, strategic choice, and policy implementation were human beings whose lives depended on the wisdom and courage of their leaders. As I prepared my notes for the next day's lectures, I received a communication that reminded me how far the Imperium had come since my own days as a frightened conscript facing his first combat deployment. Colonel Kellec, this is General Helena Voss, commanding the Segmentum Tempestus Strategic Reserve. We have a situation developing in the Ultima Segmentum that requires your particular expertise. A joint Imperial TOW task force is being assembled to address a significant Tyrannid incursion, and you have been selected to serve as Senior Advisor for Integrated Operations. A joint Imperial TOW task force. 35 years after my heresy trial, the kind of cooperation I had risked my life to implement was now official Imperial policy, supported by the highest levels of military command and sanctioned by the Inquisition itself. But more than just vindication of my earlier decisions, it represented the possibility of something genuinely new, an Imperium capable of learning, adapting, and evolving beyond the rigid orthodoxy that had defined its first 10 millennia of existence. As I accepted the assignment and began preparing for what might be the most significant operation of my career, I thought about the young cadets I was training to become the next generation of Imperial leaders. They would inherit a galaxy that was more dangerous than any their predecessors had faced, but they would also inherit institutional flexibility and adaptive capabilities that previous generations could never have imagined. The future of human civilization would depend on their ability to serve eternal values while employing ever-changing methods. But after 35 years of service to the Emperor's will, I believe they were ready for that responsibility.